Hello and welcome to Trib Talk. I'm political correspondent Bryan Schott. I host the Utah Politics Podcast, and I'm also the author of our brand new political newsletter, The Rundown, which we send out each and every weekday morning. I'd like to urge you to subscribe to that. Today, we're going to be discussing the 2020 election, which is just 14 days away. It's like a kid counting down to Christmas. And joining me on the show today are Taylor Stevens and Bethany Rodgers from our government team. They're taking time out of covering interim up at the Capitol. Appreciate you joining me. And also columnist Robert Gehrke. If you have a question you'd like to ask, you can use the hashtag Trib Talk on Twitter and also email your questions to tribtalk@sltrib.com. Let's start with the news that popped this morning. Spencer Cox, Chris Peterson sent out some joint PSAs urging civility in politics. They recorded 3 of them. I was kind of struck because it seems remarkable to me that we're in a place where political candidates saying that they will honor the results of the presidential election is something that we actually have to talk about in the news. Usually that was just a given. What do you make of this? I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it is very interesting. The governor's race between Chris Peterson and Spencer Cox, civility has kind of come up several times in the debate. It's been interesting to see the lieutenant governor in particular, I think, sort of try to contrast the debate and the discourse between him and Chris Peterson with what's going on at a national level. You know, the last debate, it occurred on the same night, actually, as the debate between Trump and Biden. And several times during the debate, Spencer Cox said, I don't really know what's happening on this other debate, but I can guess that, it's not the level of civility that we're seeing, here. So it kind of was in line, in my opinion, with at least some of the things that they're trying to call attention to so far. And it's also something that in conversations with Chris Peterson, he's been wanting Spencer Cox to say. He's noted that Spencer Cox is the state's election officer and has been, wanting him to come out and just say overtly, which, as you noted, it kind of before has been a given, but in this context, to say overtly, yes, we will respect the results of the election.
Yeah, but it seems like it's also kind of a low risk thing to say because Utah is going to Trump. I don't think that anything here is going to be contested, and Spencer Cox is most likely going to be elected the next governor. So it's kind of a low risk thing for him to say. So at the end of the day, it just seems like it's more of a feel good thing, right?
It is. It's definitely a feel good thing. And I don't think you'd necessarily be seeing them do this if it was a 1-point race or a 2.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But in a 25-point race, everybody can, shake hands and, be a good sport about it. You're not going to see Burgess Owens and Ben McAdams do an ad like this anytime soon, for sure. But I think it sends a good message. I think it's something that Utahns like to see. We like to think that we're better than DC politics, even if when push comes to shove, maybe we aren't.
Yeah, and really the people that need to hear this are the outside groups that are coming into UTO4 and just carpet bombing it with all that money and all these negative ads. I think at last count, we're up over $4 million in ads now, which is just an astonishing number with more to come. Let's talk a little bit about turnout, because that seems to be the big story of this election. We had a story this morning. The county clerks in Utah are processing lots of ballots right now. Party registrations are up for both the Republicans and the Democrats here in Utah. So far, I checked this just before we started. 34 million Americans have already cast a ballot in this election, which is just an incredible number. And also, as of this morning, about 60,000 ballots here in the state have been returned. Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report had a stat that really caught my attention, that more people right now have voted in Texas early than the number of people who voted for Trump during the entire 2016 election. So turnout is up everywhere. What are you hearing from candidates, office holders about this massive turnout? And what do you think it's going to happen here in the state? Because I've heard estimates that we could be up over, 1.4, 1.5 million votes here.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that we've got about 200,000 more people registered now than we did, I believe, 2 years ago. Maybe it was 4 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. And so that's a big jump in just registrations. It sort of points to a lot of interest in the election, a lot of energy and enthusiasm, I think, on all sides of this. Yeah, there's no reason to think that we won't hit a record in turnout. And, you know, the early turnout's a little bit hard to gauge. 60,000 votes is significant, but, you know, keep in mind, we just barely started. And those are, a lot of those that have already been cast are still in the mail or haven't been reported yet. So we're going to see those numbers jump up a lot. I think one of the encouraging things about that is that means on election night, we might have better results. You know, the more ballots that get in early, you know, we're not going to be waiting for a week or 2 weeks to find out the winners of some of these races, unless, you know, as we saw in 2018, unless it's really, really, really close.
Yeah, I think that the delays that we'll see will probably be down at the legislative level, where we'll see some of those races not decided until then. Taylor, you've been quiet. What are you hearing about the big turnout from people that you talk to? Do they think that this might have an impact on the results? Are people excited about it? Are they worried that it might throw some races that might be considered a little more safe for some of the incumbents?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to mention is that county clerks have been encouraging voters to submit their ballots early. And so it's yet to be seen, I think, because we haven't had a circumstance like that where people were being urged, you know, get your ballot, get it in the mail, get it in a drop box. It's yet to be seen kind of whether that will kind of taper off a little bit in the next few weeks as far as turnout. I do think everyone seems to agree there's going to be high turnout. Presidential year. I think one thing that will also be interesting to see is who goes and votes on election day and how that will influence the results. A recent poll that I covered showed that while most people do plan to vote by mail, whether that's putting it in a drop box or putting it through the US Postal Service, there is a segment of people and a larger segment of conservatives and Republican identifying voters who plan to go in person on election day. And so it'll be interesting to see how that influences the results that we get day of.
Remember, you can send in your questions about the election on Twitter. The hashtag is Trib Talk, and you can also email them to tribtalk@sltrib.com. Robert mentioned this in passing in his last answer, but let's look at what's happening in Congressional District 4, because that's the hottest race in the state. We had a poll that came out yesterday showing a 1-point lead for Burgess Owens. It's basically a toss-up. That's within the margin of error, so it could go either way. And we've got a lot of money pouring into it. Burgess Owens brought in a lot of campaign cash to close the gap with McAdams here at the end. Without making a prediction, what do you think is going to happen? Are we in for another 2-week slog like we were in 2018, where we had to wait to find out who won until almost the very end? I remember it was almost 2 weeks after the election that the final results came in, and all of a sudden there was a hastily called press headquarters where he could finally declare victory, because he was ahead on election night, and then Mia Love caught up to him and took the lead, and then the final count tipped it back to McAdams. Do you think that we're in for that again? Because I think maybe, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think we probably are in for a close race, at least if the polling kind of bears out what we're seeing. And just going back to what I mentioned earlier, will we see Ben McAdams come out looking like he has a strong lead on election night because of those Democratic voters who are voting by mail? And, Burgess Owens has really been appealing to a very conservative segment of the voters in Congressional District 4. So will those people vote in person and, Burgess Owens start to kind of catch up? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I could see a circumstance where the votes tighten over time as more ballots come in from those who have voted in person on election day.
Robert, what do you think of these attacks on Mitt Romney that are coming out from Burgess Owens? That's not going to play well with the moderates in that district, is at least my initial takeaway from that.
So, I think one thing, just quickly on turnout, I think we saw 2 years ago, the reason McAdams won this race was because of the initiatives, ballot initiatives that were on the ballot that really drove turnout. it was incredibly high for an off-year election. Presidential elections are always bigger, but I think, like we discussed with the big turnout we're expecting this time, I think that probably plays to his advantage a little bit. The Mitt Romney statements were just confounding because we all know how you win the 4th district. You win it in the middle, right? It's a Republican leaning district, but if you can win more of the moderates, you can win. Attacking Mitt Romney plays well with Burgess Owens' base, right? But that doesn't get him votes. That doesn't get him those middle of the road, Republican leaning independents who he needs to reach. And so I think it plays into Ben McAdams' hands. I wouldn't be surprised within the next day or so, we see ads with Ben McAdams saying Burgess Owens is attacking Mitt Romney. I think it's a huge mistake and could really cost him.
Do you remember back, I think it was in 2000 and maybe 8, no, it was 10. It was in 2006 or 10. Anyway, what happened was Jim Matheson got on the air before John Swallow in their congressional race, and he had ads of him walking with President George W. Bush, and he cozied up to Bush before Swallow ever had a chance, and I think that really helped him win against Swallow in that election. Let's bring Bethany in. You're covering Congressional District 2, and we had a debate there last night. Three people on the stage, which is something we don't usually see here in the state. Let's talk a little bit about how that debate went, and how big of an issue do you think Trump is going to be in this race in Congressional District 2? Because there was certainly a lot of talk about him last night.
Yeah, I think that it was interesting because the Democratic candidate, Cale Weston, in the debate tried to use Trump as a liability against Chris Stewart. And Chris Stewart tried to use Trump as kind of an asset in the debate. So it was sort of interesting how they both kind of felt like they were on the right side of that Trump divide, I guess. So Cale Weston, I mean, he's definitely trying to make it an issue. He's trying to clearly attract, the moderate voters by saying, here's Chris Stewart. He called Trump Benito Mussolini several years ago. Now he's Mussolini's ambassador to Utah. That was, one of the opening comments that he made. Whereas Chris Stewart is, still staunchly standing behind Trump and basically saying, yeah, I mean, he's, cracked down on COVID, according to Chris Stewart. He took action early on in the pandemic to limit travel from China and is, trying to expedite the development of a vaccine. How much that factors in the race itself? I mean, I think you can look at the polling numbers itself. They show that Chris Stewart is, about 20 percentage points ahead of Cale Weston. So it doesn't seem as if the strategy is necessarily going to yield a victory for Cale Weston, but it definitely is what he appears to be pinning his hopes on.
That's a really good point, that Stewart is ahead in this race. And I'm curious about the attempt to use Trump as a big campaign issue by Weston. I think that might not be something that gets a lot of traction in this district outside of some of the more left-leaning areas of Salt Lake City. You just don't see the more rural areas of the state, turning on Trump or seeing Trump as a liability. So, I'm just wondering. I'm trying to formulate a question about this. Chris Stewart has tied himself so closely to Trump. Do you think that he loses? He does as poorly in Salt Lake County, in the Salt Lake County portion of the district, as he did in 2018 against Shireen Gorbani? Does that hurt him even more? It's obviously not going to be enough to push Cale Weston over the finish line. But I'm wondering if you see Stewart standing among voters in the Salt Lake City part of UTO to drop even further because of Trump.
So, I mean, the dynamics in the races are very different, obviously. I looked back at the 2018 election results for the story last night and noticed that Shireen Gorbani's margin of loss was actually smaller than the margin between Cale Weston and Chris Stewart, according to the Utah Debate Commission poll. So just judging by that alone, I mean, it kind of appears that the two strategies are fairly comparable in terms of success, or, if anything, Cale Weston might not even be closing the gap quite as much as Shireen Ghorbani was able to. But it remains to be seen, who will turn out. Maybe he will be able to energize some anti-Trump voters. And, certainly the Trump versus Biden contest is the one that's going to be drawing voters the most. So, an attempt to link that race in some way, I think is his efforts to sort of like elevate it a little bit.
Taylor and Robert, sorry, Robert, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think on paper, the 2nd District and 4th District don't look all that dissimilar, because the Republican edge is about the same, 12 points to 14 points, depending on what you look at. But I think they are different in what those voters actually look like and how they vote. And so I think you see in the 4th District with large portions of Salt Lake County, you see Trump fairly unpopular, quite unpopular in Salt Lake County. Whereas in the 2nd District, even though it's got about the same Republican tilt, they're much more devoted, diehard Republicans. There's a lot more rural Republicans in that electorate. And so that makes it a lot harder, and it makes it a little bit of a risky play for Cale, I think, probably one that doesn't play to his advantage. I don't think there are any of those counties outside of Salt Lake County that Trump has any chance of losing by, or not winning by 10% or more. So I think that is probably not a winning strategy for him. But, it's also, given the way COVID has disrupted elections and campaigns this year, you've kind of got to take play the hand that's dealt to you. And so there wasn't a whole lot of alternatives for him.
Before we move on to this, Taylor, I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a possibility that Trump loses to Biden in the 4th Congressional District? I've talked with people and said that is a definite possibility. It was his worst district in 2016. He only got about 39% of the vote there. Obviously, we had Evan McMullin on the ballot. But if Trump were to drop that district to Biden, it would be the first time that a Democrat carries a congressional district in this state since 1964, and that would be stunning. Do you think that we might be looking at that?
I think, as Robert mentioned earlier, a lot of this is going to come down to turnout. In 2018, Ben McAdams did have the benefit of all of those ballot initiatives, medical marijuana. I definitely think, as Bethany said, there's a lot of energy among the Democrats in getting out and voting in this race. So it'll all depend on turnout as far as whether he's able to do that. And I think if Biden was able to win in the 4th Congressional District, that would indicate a pretty big shift for the 4th Congressional District, which is currently rated as a toss-up. So it'd be a big change as to what we're thinking it would be right now.
And I jumped all over Bethany. You had a point?
Oh yeah, one thing I wanted to add on CD2 that I kind of just think is sort of interesting is that while Cale is kind of taking this strategy of attack on Chris Stewart for his ties with Trump, and that might not do so well in some of the rural parts of Utah, he's also made a very concerted effort to court rural areas of Utah. So I think that's kind of an interesting dichotomy. He's traveled a lot in rural parts of the district. He's even advertised on the Sean Hannity show in an effort to reach some of these voters. So I just think that's kind of an interesting split. It kind of suggests that he's hoping to peel away some of those maybe more moderate, rural or, right-leaning voters who might be a little bit disenfranchised with Trump, or try to sort of drive a wedge in there somewhere. I don't know if that space exists, but it seems like he's going after some voters.
That's a good point. Remember, you can send in your questions using the hashtag Trib Talk on Twitter, or you can email them to tribtalk@sltrib.com. Question emailed from a viewer right now. There seems to be more uncontested races on my ballot than in previous years. Any idea why? Anyone want to take that?
I believe our colleague Lee Davidson did some reporting on this, particularly around the legislative races earlier this year. And there were several candidates who had actually dropped out because of COVID and the impact that was having on their businesses, on their families. So I'm not sure if how that extends to some of these other races that we're seeing as uncontested, but I know that at least in some of the legislative races, that was a factor for candidates, people who are struggling financially. If you're a new candidate, maybe you don't have the money to put in of your own into a campaign. Fundraising is a little bit tighter right now as a lot of people are struggling or without jobs. So I definitely think that the pandemic could have a role to play in why we're seeing some of those maybe incumbent or better funded candidates running unopposed in this race.
And Robert, you got to pay the pet tax.
Yeah,
got to show him.
Oh, I got to show you. Got to see the.
Yeah, you have to show him. It's the pet tax.
Yeah,
awesome. Okay, so Robert pays the pet tax. I think it also depends on where you live, whether you're seeing those uncontested races. Because I live in Salt Lake County, and I think I only had one on my ballot. So, I think that's another factor.
I think we're also there are a lot of incumbents that are long-term incumbents, and so you see people like, running against Senator Todd Weiler, for example. That's an uncontested race up there. Davis County hasn't elected a Democrat, I think, in like 40 years. He's an entrenched incumbent. He's going to have a fundraising advantage. A lot of these races, people recognize, I think, are just no-win situations for him, and so you see people. It's hard for parties to recruit somebody to run in a seat where they know they can't win.
Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned this. How much has COVID changed this election? The way that people are campaigning, the way that people are raising funds. Masks have not become that big of a deal in some of the higher profile races. It was a big deal in the Republican primaries where they talked about masks, but that sort of faded away, and it's not much of an issue as people are focused on some of the other things out there. So how much of an issue do you think that this is, or how much of an impact has this had? Is it more the way that campaigns have been approaching these races rather than something that we would not notice?
I'll take a crack at it, and I think Taylor and Bethany probably have some more sort of specific how it's affected specific races. But obviously, we saw in the primary, like you mentioned, it totally disrupted the way how candidates can campaign. They can't do the big, parades and fairs and knocking on doors and all of these things. I think what that does is it sort of tends to favor the incumbent and tends to favor the candidate with the most money, because it's just hard for a challenger. Take the Chris Stewart-Cale Weston race we were talking about, to go out and outwork the incumbent, and then to overcome the fundraising disadvantage, and then that fundraising advantage translates into an advertising advantage. And I just think this has kind of become the grassroots campaign is almost irrelevant this time through, because we're trying to avoid the grass, I guess. and so I just think I think it's completely transformed the way we've seen the campaigns this time, but I also think it's played to the incumbent's advantage.
Any other thoughts? Okay, then we will move on. It makes sense. I agree. It's a hard thing to really put your thumb on to see how this has changed things. We did see a lot of it during the primary elections. What did you make of those disingenuous mailers from the Democrats that went out against a number of legislative incumbents, where they, for instance, we're looking at Craig Hall, we're looking at Steve Ellison, we're looking at Mike Winder, people who voted against the tax reform package, and the mailers say their caucus voted for it, and so it was a really cute trick that these mailers were trying to do. You saw the Republicans just screaming bloody murder when these came out, because it was a late attack. The timing was really hard for them to counteract. And I guess that leads to a larger question: how big of an issue is tax reform playing in some of these down ballot races? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I've done some reporting on this, and I think as far as the mailers go, I think the Democrats have identified this as a potentially winning strategy. We saw they ousted Lyle Hilliard in the primary, and he's been in the legislature for a long time and was a big proponent of that tax reform measure. But I think that it did, at least online, I don't think that it helped them. The response that they received, a lot of people felt that that was disingenuous and was not a fair attack on some of those Republican lawmakers who had voted against it. And so, I think that this is kind of their strategy, because they've seen that this is an issue that voters care a lot about. And a lot of candidates have been running on this platform of saying, I gathered signatures for the ballot initiative. I was organizing against the tax reform package, but it might blow up in their face a little bit because they didn't stick to attacking the people who actually were behind the ballot measure. They took it a little bit too far.
Mm-hmm.
Just to jump in on that,
sure.
I think it's interesting. I haven't seen as much talk about tax reform itself. In some of the debates, it pops up here and there, but it doesn't really seem to be, it was such a hot button issue early in the year. And of course, COVID has kind of replaced a lot of the, taken up all the oxygen when it comes to these debates. But to me, it was sort of emblematic, I think, of a feeling among a lot of voters who are upset that they didn't think the legislature has been listening to them. They've passed initiatives and the initiatives have been replaced, they've been tweaked, they've been changed. And then you have this tax reform package that comes and it's kind of muscled through, even though there's just sort of this large outcry. So I think it's kind of interesting that the tax reform issue is kind of interesting in the sense that it reflects a larger sort of, disenfranchisement among some voters with the way the legislature at large is kind of approaches its interaction with the public.
Well, you bring up a really great point. How much are the initiatives that all the ones that passed in 2018, every single one of them was changed significantly by the legislature? Are they talking about that on the campaign trail? How potent of an issue is that? Because you would hear people say, "Don't do this, or you're gonna face retribution at the ballot box." Are they going to face that? Is the question. I'm wondering how much of a potent issue that is. Are you encountering that at all?
I've seen people raise that as a point. I mean, I don't know that's something that Chris Peterson has even pointed to. He's said on the campaign trail, hey, like, we have a Republican dominated state government, and, why don't you try a Democrat for change to see if that might change things up? And, I would respect the will of the people. So he's definitely trying to use that as sort of a call to voters. But whether or not that will really, whether or not the legislators who are involved in these decisions will be the ones who will actually get booted out, I'm not sure. As Taylor mentioned, Lyle Hilliard has already gotten, lost his primary race and is out. So it seems that at least for a few lawmakers, there will be an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of expected there to be a little bit more blowback, perhaps, but there are several of these races that are going to be, these legislative races where the incumbents, long-term incumbents in some instances, guys like Eric Hutchings, guys like Jim Dunnigan, we mentioned Hall and Winder, they're not quite as long tenured, but I mean, these guys are in real trouble. Cheryl Acton, I think, is one who could lose her seat this time. Yeah. These are all races that are close and races that have the potential to flip from R to D. In some small part because of the tax reform and because of, as Bryan mentioned, the way that they treated the initiative process. So I think we could see some significant change this year, even though, again, like the incumbents or the challengers were at somewhat of a disadvantage in terms of getting their message out. I also don't want to single out Democrats as the only ones that run disingenuous ads or misleading ads.
Yeah, for sure.
Every year we see this in a handful of hotly contested races, and it's no party has a corner on that market.
I think that's why the pearl clutching was so I guess grating on some people about that. I'm sorry, I stepped on someone there.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say that, I think it's been really interesting to see how much all of these races have changed. And I think the issues that we thought would play into races are not the issues that are playing into races. As Bethany mentioned, tax reform was such an explosive issue just a few months ago, but I think it feels like a lifetime to many voters. And again, in the CD4 race, Congressional District 4, with Ben McAdams, I think that the Republican Party had anticipated that McAdams's impeachment vote would play a much bigger role in this race than it has. And I think to so many Americans, that feels like so long ago, eclipsed by so many other issues, especially, in Utah, we've had windstorms and earthquakes and a pandemic. And, it just feels like a lifetime ago to voters. And that's not the primary things that they're thinking of when they're when they're filling out their ballot this year. So it's been really interesting to see how those issues have changed versus what we thought they might be even 8 months ago.
That is an excellent point. I always tell people voters have very, very short memories, and what you think might be an issue this time around won't be at all. I mean, I look at what's happening in the national campaign, and no one's talking about immigration, and that was a huge issue just 4 years ago. Anybody have a final point to make before we let you guys go and get back to work?
This is the first election without oh my goodness, without straight ticket voting. So I think
yes.
That's sort of an interesting little note. I am curious to see if it will make any difference at all, whether there'll be more participation in some of the nonpartisan races. People will sort of put more thought into filling out their ballots, but I just think that's kind of an interesting little quirk.
Something to watch.
And I'd just like to encourage people to go to sltrib.com. We've got coverage on the ballot initiatives, on major candidates, and check out our reporting there and get more details as you're filling out your ballot.
Yeah, I was just going to mention this 7 constitutional amendments. It's an awful lot. Do your homework on them because, there are some that are simple and there are some that are complicated, and we've had reporting on all of them. Check out the judges, the Judicial Evaluation Committee. Has flyers out on that. I mean, there's a lot of resources out there. You've got time with your ballot. It's important to look at. And I would just say, in terms of what to watch, one thing I kind of touched on, some of these legislative races I think are going to flip, and I think Democrats are going to pick up a few seats in the state house in particular. Heading into redistricting, they'll probably get those wiped out again, like we see every 10 years. But there's a potential for a little bit of a change this election.
Yeah, should be interesting to watch. Taylor beat me to the plug. I'd like to plug my newsletter, The Rundown. It's in your email box every weekday morning. Subscribe to that, and also subscribe to my podcast, Utah Politics. We've got some great guests coming up. I think we've got Josh Krashour from National Journal tomorrow. We've got Abby Huntsman coming on at the end of the week to talk politics. So subscribe. I would appreciate that. All right. Thank you to Taylor, Stevens, Bethany Rodgers, and Robert Gehrke. And thank you for watching. And tune in next week for another edition. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.